Audio of Unit 6, Part 2, The Scientific Revolution and the Enlightenment. The Scientific Revolution. Throughout the 1500s into the 1600s, several factors led to a scientific revolution with its reliance on human reason for understanding nature. There is a direct connection between the Renaissance era and the scientific revolution. If it had not been for the humanistic ideals of the Renaissance that focused on man being able to make his own decisions, man should be recognized for his accomplishments, he can do great things, man has a spark of the divine within him, so therefore God would want him to use his reason to figure things out. If there had never been that, there would never have been a scientific revolution. So there is a direct connection, direct correlation between the Renaissance era and the scientific revolution. They directly connect to each other. The new philosophy calls into doubt. The element of fire is quite put out. The sun is lost, and the earth, and no man's wit can well direct him where to look for it. John Donne, English poet, basically referencing the idea that everything that they thought they knew about the universe before the scientific revolution was kind of set on its head. And now they're trying to figure things out in this new world order. Medieval universities encouraged a new respect for science. So this actually goes back to even before the Renaissance era. But the scholastic movement of the medieval period, of the high Middle Ages that we discussed in a previous unit, tried to make new science agree with religious beliefs. If you recall what we said about the scholastic movement, they kind of tethered or connected science and religion. They would only allow you to use reason if you could use it to support your ideas of faith. Reason for reason's sake was not allowed in the scholastic movement of the 12th and 13th centuries. However, we know that that has been freed up a bit as we went through the Renaissance era. The Renaissance humanism, as stated before, stimulated science by rediscovering things from the ancient world that were based on rationalism, rediscovering ancient math in particular. Although scientists will refute many classical theorems, but they will use them as a jumping point to then delve deeper and discover that maybe even though the ancients were not absolutely correct about something, the inquiry, the asking of questions leads to more truth in the long run. We also know that the Reformation opened the door to scientific inquiry by weakening the Church, the Roman Catholic Church. Theories contradicting the Church were considered heresy, as we know, and during the Catholic Counter-Reformation, many of them were attacked, and writings were put on the index of prohibited books. But that did not stop the inquiry from happening, especially because the printing press allowed for the spread of these ideas. So we're making a lot of connections back to previous units. This is something that was said by Francis Bacon, who was the guy who kind of precipitates the idea of inductive reasoning, which is, of course, part of the modern day scientific method. He said, God has placed no limits to the exercise of the intellect he has given us on this side of the grave. In other words, God gave us the ability to reason. That's what separates us from his other creations. Therefore, he wants us to use that reason. Scientists had better ways of obtaining knowledge about the world by the 1500s and 1600s as well. They had developed new technology, some of which was tied to navigation, especially during that age of exploration. They took telescopes that they used to help see things far away at sea and started turning them to the heavens and started putting more and more lenses behind one another to see the stars and the planets up close and personal. Those telescopes, sextants, which help to measure where the stars are and chart them. These things, like I say, used for navigation before, now are showing us new things about the universe that may not have been known before. And of course, this helps to spread scientific knowledge, especially with the printing press. The ideas would be printed, they would be shared with other people, and this is not just happening in one place in Europe as a result. The ideas will spread from country to country as well. The scientific method ultimately was established, producing things like skepticism, mathematical formulation, the use of empirical evidence from verifiable observation, and the freedom of inquiry. Okay, and y'all are familiar with the scientific method. You've been studying it since you were little kids in science class, where you have a hypothesis about a certain thing. You do experiments to test that hypothesis. You collect your data or your results, and then you come up with findings and conclusions. And to see if your original hypothesis was not correct, then you change your hypothesis and you test it again. The first rule in logical studies was never to receive anything as truth which I did not clearly know to be such. The second rule was to divide every difficulty which I should examine into as many parts as possible. The third rule was to conduct my thoughts in an orderly manner, beginning with objects the most simple and the easiest to understand. The last rule was to make enumeration so complete and review so comprehensive that I should be certain of omitting nothing. This was from René Descartes, who is famous for his inductive reasoning method, which is the other side of the scientific method. So Bacon with inductive reasoning, where you start with facts and you whittle it down to try to come up to the truth. And René Descartes with deductive reasoning, where you start with a truth and then you break it down to try to explain why it's true. Both sides of the scientific method coin, if you will. The European belief in a geocentric or earth-centered universe was based on ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle's findings, as well as a Roman astronomer named Ptolemy. Both of them had argued that the earth was at the center of the universe and everything in the heavens revolved around the earth, including the sun. Ptolemy was around 150 AD, and he really reemphasized this in his writings, placing the earth at the center of the universe, with the moon, Mercury, Venus, the sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn circling our planet. The Roman Catholic authorities liked this very much throughout the medieval period because it seemed to dovetail nicely with their ideas of how God arranged the universe. If God made man as his greatest creation, then why would he not place us at the center of the universe and have everything else revolve around us? So the Ptolemaic or geocentric theory, the earth-centered universe, carried on for centuries throughout the Middle Ages, and it will be challenged eventually in the 1500s, largely because of the new ideas of inquiry that came from Renaissance humanism. When folks like Copernicus look to the source themselves with those navigational tools like telescopes, okay, looking to the skies, looking to the heavens themselves, and finding that those earlier explanations just do not seem to really fit, do not seem to really explain why things move the way they do through the heavens. In 1543, the year that Copernicus died, Nicholas Copernicus published his book called On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Orbs or Heavenly Spheres. And in this book, he finally revealed what he saw as a heliocentric model of the universe, meaning sun-centered. He said in this book, at the middle of all things lies the sun. As the location of this luminary in the cosmos, that most beautiful temple, would there be any other place or any better place than the center from which it can light up everything at the same time? Hence, the sun is not inappropriately called by some the lamp of the universe, by others its mind, and by others its ruler. Copernicus looked to the source himself to try to find answers and found that placing the sun at the center of the universe seemed to explain better the way things move through the heavens at different times of the year. Ultimately, he had this as a theory, but did not have the math to prove it. He publishes this the last year of his life because he didn't want to get in trouble with the Roman Catholic Church. As you see, 1543 is at the heart, the peak of the Catholic Counter-Reformation, and he was from Poland, which was Roman Catholic nation. He even dedicated his book to the Pope to try to stay out of trouble. He will actually die and not really ever have to suffer any repercussions for his work from the Roman Catholic Church. But as I said, he did not really have the mathematics to prove his theory. That will be done by later folks that will build upon his ideas. And that's something that we see a lot through the scientific revolution. It is a building blocks thing. The ideas of one person become the foundation of the next person will build upon that and increase the ideas, and the next person and the next person and the next person. So there's direct correlation between the ideas of these scientific thinkers as we go through the scientific revolution. Copernicus's heliocentric universe drew criticism ultimately from both Catholics and Protestants, who both supported the geocentric model initially. But as I said, he died the year that it was published, his book was published, so he never had to suffer any repercussions from it. Copernicus said, perhaps there will be babblers who, although completely ignorant of mathematics, nevertheless pass judgments on mathematical questions and, badly distorting some passages of Scripture to their purpose, will dare to find fault with my undertaking and censure it. I disregard them even to the extent as despising their criticism as unfounded. As I stated before, however, the scientific revolution builds upon itself. And after Copernicus comes up with this theory of a sun-centered universe, a heliocentric universe, eventually others will come up with proofs to prove that he was right, with research and data. In 1573, a man named Tycho Brahe actually ended up rejecting the Aristotelian notion of an unchanging perfect universe. And eventually, even though out loud he never showed direct support for the Copernican model, because he rejected the Aristotelian notion of an unchanging and perfect universe, ultimately the data that he collects will be used by later thinkers to prove the Copernican heliocentric universe. So Tycho Brahe from Denmark collects the data that will eventually prove Copernicus's theory. It will not actually be proven by Brahe, but his data will be used by later thinkers to prove the Copernican model of a sun-centered universe as true. Eventually, it will be a person who worked with Brahe in his observatory, Johannes Kepler, 1609, another Danish man, who formulated, using the data from Brahe, formulated the laws of planetary motion, at least the beginnings of it, with the idea that not only is the sun at the center of the universe, planets revolving around the sun, but he also stated that the reason why things seem to move more quickly through the sky at certain times of the year is because the rotations of the planets around the sun are not in perfect circles, but instead are in ellipses, where they're kind of smushed circles, semicircles, if you will, or ovals, rather. And ultimately, these ellipses, when you're around the short part of the ellipse, is when the planet seems to be moving more quickly through space. So these are the basis of the first laws of planetary motion that Johannes Kepler came up with. The first law stated that each planet moves in an elliptical orbit with its star, which is the sun, at one focus, meaning at the center. The second law is the law of equal areas, which states an orbiting object will take the same amount of time to travel between points A and B as it takes to travel between points C and D. Even though it's a shorter point on the ellipse, it looks like it's traveling farther or faster. It's actually the same amount of time. The third law shows the law of harmonics. The square of a planet's orbital time is proportional to its average distance from the star or the sun cubed. In 1610, building on Kepler's ideas, Galileo Galilei perfected the telescope for astronomical observation. He's not the first person to build a telescope, but he perfects it and makes it more usable for astronomical observation, placing lenses, multiple lenses behind each other to get a closer look at the planets in the heavens. Galileo's observations will lead him to continue to build upon the formulation of the laws of motion and inertia and mathematically prove the Copernican theory. So he builds upon the data collected by Brahe and the theories of the laws of motion that were created by Johannes Kepler, continuing to build on that, and formulates the laws of motion and inertia. Ultimately, inertia meaning that something will continue to move in the same direction at the same speed until acted upon by another force. Ultimately, these will help to prove the Copernican theory in the long run. Galileo, however, got into trouble because he was from Italy and he was living in the early 1600s at the peak of the Catholic Counter-Reformation, and the Roman Catholic Church ultimately challenged Galileo for his ideas. They eventually brought him before the Roman Inquisition in Rome and put him on trial for heresy. He was forced by the clergy, by the officials of the Roman Catholic Church, to retract his support of heliocentrism or face death. So he went back on his word and said that he was wrong about the sun-centered universe to protect his life. Ultimately, he will live under house arrest for the rest of his life, but it is said that he would continue to work on his ideas. Even though he retracted, he never fully really believed that in his heart. In his heart, he knew that the heliocentric theory was correct, and he continued to work until his dying day. His ideas will not be removed from the index of prohibited books, however, until the 20th century. He said, "I do not feel obliged to believe that the same God who has endowed us with sense, reason, and intellect has intended for us to forego their use." Even so, he was forced to recant his ideas in order to save his life. Now we come to Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton from Great Britain ultimately synthesizes the astronomy of Copernicus and Kepler with the physics of Galileo. Synthesizing means blending together. So Isaac Newton takes all of the ideas of the previous scientists before him and he combines them together into a new holistic, complete view of the universe. Okay, this is why we call it Newtonian physics. Okay, so he takes the astronomy of Copernicus and Kepler, combines it with the physics of Galileo into this new view of the universe. Newton published in 1687 probably the most significant book on physics until Albert Einstein. Okay, he published his book that's known as the Principia. Sometimes it's called the Principia Mathematica. Okay, and it details how gravity works ultimately. And ultimately, not just gravity as a law of motion, a natural law that governs the universe. He described that all forms of celestial and terrestrial motion happens because of gravity. Celestial meaning in the heavens, terrestrial meaning on the earth. All motion happens because of gravity and the relationship between objects is determined by this gravity. The distance of the objects from one another makes the gravitational pull different. So gravity and the relationship between objects based on this gravity is what determines why things move the way they do in the universe. And he ultimately argued that this gravity, as well as other things like what Galileo had determined with inertia, these laws, these natural laws, are set in place by the Creator to govern the universe. And if we can just figure out what those natural laws are that govern the universe, we can predict what movements could happen within the universe, in the heavens, in the future. These natural laws that govern the universe were placed in motion by God when He created the universe. He creates the universe, He creates the natural laws that govern it, and Newton argued then he would step back and let it move as it would according to those natural laws, rather than getting actively involved on a daily basis to change things. There was no need for that if he established the laws that determined how things would go. Isaac Newton wrote, "All matter attracts all other matter with a force proportional to the product of their masses and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them." And this ultimately is based on what's called the law of universal gravitation. Every object in the universe attracts every other object with a force directed along the line of centers for the two objects that is proportional to the product of their masses and inversely proportional to the square of the separation between the two objects. And it's explained there in a mathematical formula. Now, this will become the basis of modern physics. Well, modern at the time, I should say. Eventually, this will be challenged by Einstein's ideas, but this will be the basis of what will be physics as well as calculus. Calculus being the mathematics of physics will also be developed by Isaac Newton. Newton showed that the universe was governed by these universal or natural laws, and that can be expressed mathematically ultimately. And that's why he develops calculus, to explain the mathematics behind the physics. Newton's concepts of the universe dominated Western thought, as I said before, until Einstein comes around in the 20th century, in the early 1900s. So Newtonian physics will basically dominate the world of physics until the 1900s, 300 years later, when some of those ideas are challenged by Albert Einstein's ideas. We'll get there in a later unit. Now, success in understanding the laws of nature or the natural laws that govern the universe will eventually lead philosophers to also determine maybe there are natural laws that govern human nature. Maybe we can use the scientific method to try to figure out the laws that govern human nature and society. And if there are natural laws that govern the universe, since God created those that live in the universe, perhaps he established natural laws to govern how humans should interact with each other in society. If we can figure those out using our reason, using our scientific method of observation, maybe we can figure out how to make society work better and how to govern it better. Maybe we can develop better forms of government, better kinds of economics. This will give birth to what is called the Enlightenment. There is a direct correlation between the scientific revolution in the 15 and 1600s and the Enlightenment of the 1700s. So let's now talk about the Enlightenment. In the 1700s, the Enlightenment saw what we call philosophes. Philosophe is just a French word for philosopher, but we refer to the Enlightenment thinkers as philosophes. Okay, so as I said before, in the 1700s, the Enlightenment saw philosophes question the authority of absolute rulers, which was the primary kind of governing structure that was in all of Europe, most of Europe, except for, of course, in England and in the Dutch Republic. They also challenged and questioned the authority of religion, okay, not necessarily being atheist, but challenging the idea of organized religion and other traditions. Instead, these Enlightenment philosophers championed things like individual rights. As I said before, this is directly connected back to the Renaissance. This was caused by the Renaissance, that spirit of inquiry that we talk about with the Renaissance, and the scientific revolution, the scientific study of society and the universe, as well as being caused by the Protestant Reformation, which helped to weaken the authority of the Roman Catholic Church. All of these things are directly connected to the Enlightenment happening. The Age of Enlightenment would never have happened had it not been for the Renaissance, the Scientific Revolution, and the Protestant Reformation, in other words. Philosophers believed reason, or informed thinking, should not be tethered or influenced by things like intolerance, bigotry, and superstition. Reason should not be tied to anything else. Reason should be explored as far as you can take it without being kept to not be allowed to think or be allowed to reason about certain things. So they want to untether it from just supporting your religious ideology like it had been during the scholastic movement of the high Middle Ages. Many philosophers were what we call deists, okay? They thought of God as a cosmic watchmaker who created the universe, established the laws that would govern it, those natural laws that Newton had talked about, and then stepped aside to let the universe run according to those natural laws that God had created. So deists were not atheists, but they were believers in what they called natural religion. They did not really adhere to the ideals of any particular denomination of religion, of Christianity, or, whether it be Protestant Christianity or Catholic Christianity or even Judaism or Islam. They believed in natural religion. There is a creator. He did create the universe and all that's in it. He created the laws that govern it, and he stepped back and did not get involved on a daily basis. This was what the deists believed and what the Enlightenment philosophes promoted. To believe in God is impossible, they would say. Not to believe in him, however, is absurd. Voltaire, a very famous philosopher that we'll talk about in a later slide, is the one who said this. Philosophers believed natural laws regulate both the universe and human society, and they can be discovered by human reason. Be courageous and steady to the laws, and you cannot fail, is what Newton had said. Philosophers tried to expose social problems and then propose reforms to correct those social problems. This made the Enlightenment thought more accessible to a wide range of people. Their target audiences were anyone who could read, and they would publish these ideas in newspapers and magazines, or what they called, pamphlets or periodicals. The idea was that if somebody could read and could reason, that was their audience, and they were trying to expose these are the problems of our society. How can we use reason to fix the problems in our society? Okay, if you can use reason to figure out the natural laws that govern the universe and understand how that works, perhaps if we can figure out what the natural laws that govern society are, we can figure out reforms to get back to allowing those natural laws of society to govern things. And this was one of the reasons why the Enlightenment philosophers proposed the idea of natural rights of man. And of course, our nation is founded on the principles of the natural rights of man. So America is a direct byproduct of Enlightenment thought. We'll talk more about that in a later unit. Most philosophers or philosophers, the Enlightenment thinkers, were French, but they were not all French. Okay, the reason we use the French word philosophe is because so many of them were from France. Many of them were from France, but not all. They were also from across Europe and different parts of Europe, and even in the American colonies, as we will see. It's interesting because one of the things that these philosophers were speaking out against was absolute rule of government, saying that it impinged upon the natural rights of man, of life, liberty, and property. We'll talk more about that, John Locke's ideas, moving forward. So it's interesting that many of these philosophers came from France because, of course, they were living under one of the strongest of the absolute monarchies in all of Europe. Perhaps they were reacting against what they were living under, and that's why so many of them were from France. Now, let's talk about Thomas Hobbes. We mentioned him in a previous unit. But Thomas Hobbes was an English philosopher. We don't really consider him an Enlightenment philosopher, although his ideas will help to prompt the Enlightenment. Thomas Hobbes wrote a book called The Leviathan. He had lived through the very violent and chaotic English Civil War, where the King Charles I of the Stuart dynasty fought against the parliamentary forces and lost. He eventually will be beheaded as a traitor to England, and England will be ruled without a king for a little while under Oliver Cromwell, who ruled the parliamentary forces in what is called the English Commonwealth. Now, we know that eventually, by the time we get into the 1660s, there will be a restoration of the Stuart monarchy with Charles II. We talked about this in a previous unit. During that period, however, where Cromwell was in charge of England, we know that he reduced the amount of culture that was allowed to be practiced in England. He was a Puritan, remember? And it was a bit chaotic, ultimately. The result of this English Civil War was seen by some, like Hobbes, as creating chaos in English society. So Thomas Hobbes was responding to what he had witnessed in his own life. He wrote the Leviathan, which is basically a sea monster. That's, he used that imagery of that they had created this chaotic, monstrous government under the Cromwell period. He wrote this book, Leviathan, arguing ultimately that humans are naturally selfish and violent, and that they could not govern themselves. He ultimately argued that an absolute monarch is necessary in order to make society run properly. Otherwise, society will spin into chaos. So he did support the idea of absolute monarchy. But Hobbes did not believe in the idea of the divine right theory of absolute monarchy. He did not believe that God willed that person to have that power, so they couldn't be challenged. Instead, he argued that the people of a nation gave the power to an absolute monarch in exchange for him creating a place where law and order would be adhered to, a peaceful society. Once the people gave the monarch that power, they could not take it back from him. His power was ultimately absolute. So Thomas Hobbes believed in absolute monarchy. Even though he didn't believe in divine right absolute monarchy, he believed that absolute monarchy was necessary because man, by his basic nature, was so greedy and violent that he could not govern himself. And once power was given to a monarch, it was absolute and could not be taken back by the people. He said, "For the laws of nature, as justice, equity, modesty, mercy, and, in some, doing to others as we would be done to, of themselves, without the terror of some power to cause them to be observed, are contrary to our natural passions that carry us to partiality, pride, revenge, and the like. Human nature is too selfish." In a society without absolutism, there would be no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, a continual fear and danger of violent death. And the life of man would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Now, on the other side of the coin, however, we have another English philosopher named John Locke. Now, he wrote his book, Two Treatises of Government, in 1689, the year after the Glorious Revolution, which was, of course, where King James II was basically run out of England, and instead his daughter and her husband, Mary and William of Orange, were invited to come in and rule England as their new constitutional monarchs. He was responding to what had happened during his lifetime in his book. Because if you recall what we discussed with the Glorious Revolution, we have the creation of a constitutional monarchy where the monarch's powers are limited by, quote, the people, end quote. But of course, those people were the ones who were allowed to vote for the parliament in England, which were still primarily only the wealthy people. He published his book, Two Treatises on Government, in 1689, arguing that humans had the natural rights of life, liberty, and property. His opinion of man in his natural state was that man was basically good, unlike Hobbes, who had said man was selfish and always at war with himself and others. So the opinion of humanity, one saying they are basically bad, one saying they are basically good, is where they really differ here. And ultimately, because of that difference of opinion of humanity and human nature, we see why they believe in different kinds of government. John Locke ultimately was arguing in this document that the natural rights of man, which were life, liberty, and property, were ultimately what the basis of the government should be. He argued that the people have the power in a state, and they give that power to a monarch in exchange for that monarch protecting their natural rights of life, liberty, and property. If the monarch, however, goes against that mandate where he's supposed to protect the natural rights of life, liberty, and property, if he acts in a way that goes against the will of the people, or what Locke called the consent of the governed, then those people have the right to rebel against that monarch, because the monarch was not upholding his end of what Locke called the social contract. So this is ultimately justifying what had happened in England with the Glorious Revolution. King James II, being Catholic, raising his son to be Catholic, the English Parliament saw as a violation of the natural rights of the Englishmen to not be governed by a Catholic king. So therefore they had the right to rebel against him. All mankind being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. Locke wrote, as I stated, that government must protect the natural rights of man, and that people had the right to overthrow or rebel against an ineffective or abusive government. He wrote this: "No government can have a right to obedience from a people who have not freely consented to it. Men under any government, established without the consent of the people, are not in the state of free man, but are direct slaves under the force of war. Tyranny is the exercise of power beyond right, which nobody can have a right to. And this is making use of the power not for the good of those who are under it, but for his own private separate advantage. Tyranny exists when the leader, however entitled, makes not the law, but his will the rule, and his commands and actions are not directed to the preservation of the properties of his people, but the satisfaction of his own ambition, revenge, covetousness, and any other irregular passion. For no man or society of men having a power to deliver up their preservation, or consequently the means of it, to the absolute will and arbitrary dominion of another, whenever any one shall go about to bring them into such a slavish condition, they will always have a right to preserve what they have not a power to part with, and to rid themselves of those who invade this fundamental, sacred, and unalterable law of self-preservation, for which they entered into society. And thus the community may be said in this respect to be always the supreme power." If you think about it, you will understand that our nation of America was founded on these principles that were stated in Locke's two treatises of government. We believed that the King of England was violating our natural rights of life, liberty, and what Thomas Jefferson will call pursuit of happiness. He directly quoted from a lot of what Locke had said in our Declaration of Independence. So therefore, we had the right to rebel against that king. We will talk more about this direct correlation between the Enlightenment thought and the age of revolutions, the American Revolution and the French Revolution, in a later unit. So Locke ultimately can be seen as one of the earliest of the Enlightenment philosophes. Even though technically he dies in 1704 at the very beginning of the 18th century, which the Enlightenment is said to be the 18th century Enlightenment, he's oftentimes seen as the grandfather of the philosophes, the grandfather of the Enlightenment. His ideas will be the jumping point from which the other philosophes will launch themselves. They will take his ideas as the foundation and they will run with them. So the next great philosophe that we need to discuss, who builds on the ideas of Locke, is Baron de Montesquieu. In 1748, Montesquieu wrote a book called The Spirit of the Laws, where he argued an ideal government ultimately separated powers into three different branches or types of governing forces. He said, when the legislative and executive powers are united in the same person or in the same body of magistrates, like there was with an absolute monarch, there can be no liberty, because apprehensions may arise that the same monarch or senate should enact tyrannical laws to execute them in a tyrannical manner. So if all the power is too much in one institution, it will lead to tyranny. The only way to avoid that tyranny that Montesquieu described in Spirit of the Laws is to divide authority into different levels of government. The executive branch, the judicial branch, and the legislative branch were designed to protect individual rights. Ultimately, the executive governing force had the power to put laws into action. The legislative part, okay, like a parliament, or in our case, like our Congress, had the power to make laws and to change laws. And the judiciary had the power to make judgments on the law. Each of these different branches of government had a different power, and each of those powers could check the powers of the other branches. This creates a balance of power among the different branches of government, and it helps to avoid tyranny. Not one branch has more power than the other. They all have different powers, and they balance each other out. This was designed specifically to protect the individual rights of those who are governed in this society. Voltaire is another French philosopher building on these ideas of natural rights and freedoms. And in 1759, he wrote the novel Candide, which basically used satire, pointing out the problems of 18th century European society, and it called for political and social reforms. In Candide, he criticized the monarchies of Europe as being too power hungry. Absolute monarchies, the way they were instead of protecting the people, were exploiting the people, were not adhering to the needs of society. He did not necessarily believe in a balance of powers or branches of government like Montesquieu said, but he did not believe that a monarch should be tyrannical. He believed that the role of a monarch was to look out for the best interests of the people. Okay, and he thought that, society in Europe, the way it was organized based on privilege, having, the nobility having certain privileges just because of their birth was not fair. Voltaire also criticized a lot about the intolerance of religion in European society. He criticized both Catholic and Protestants for being too rigid in their ideas and not being tolerant of other religious beliefs. And he pointed to the fact that Jews were still being targeted throughout European society by the Inquisitions and even by Protestants as well. So he called for what we call religious toleration. And religious toleration will be another ideal of the Enlightenment. So the idea of a government based on the natural rights of man is one. And having a society based on religious toleration is another ideal of the Enlightenment. He wrote, in general, the art of government consists of taking as much money as possible from one class of citizens to give it to another. And he said that that was wrong. It is dangerous to be right when the government is wrong. is another thing that he said. He was very witty and used satire and wit a lot in his writings. And it got him into trouble every now and then in France, needless to say, since he was criticizing the way French society was organized and, of course, the absolute monarchy, based what he saw as more tyrannical than looking and adhering to the needs of its people. Here's an excerpt from his work Candide. In the country of Westphalia, in the castle of the most noble Baron Thunder ten Tronckh, lived a youth whom nature had endowed with a most sweet disposition. His face was the true index of his mind. He had a solid judgment joined to the most unaffected simplicity, and hence, I presume, he had his name of Candide, which means complacency. The old servants of the house suspected him to have been the son of a baron's sister, by a very good sort of gentleman of the neighborhood, whom that young lady refused to marry, because he could produce no more than 11 quarterings in his arms, the rest of the genealogical tree belonging to the family having been lost through the injuries of time. In other words, he's criticizing European society that says a certain person can't marry another person because they don't have enough noble status. He was criticizing the fact that European society was based on privilege and based on ludicrous ideas of inequality. Voltaire also wrote in 1764 the Philosophical Dictionary, where he proposed even more about his freedom of religion or religious toleration. He attacked religion, organized religion, as fanaticism and superstition. He was not attacking faithfulness. He would be a deist. But he was attacking organized religion, which he saw as too rigid and not being tolerant of other beliefs that are different than one particular religious group. He said if God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him for these people to consider that they were right. He also said Christianity is the most ridiculous, the most absurd and bloody religion that has ever infected the world. Now, of course, his opinion of Christianity was a lot based upon what he was seeing in France, which was a Roman Catholic country. And we know at the time the Roman Catholic Church was not always the most non-corrupt institution. So he's not really talking about Christianity as a faith as we know it today, as much as he was criticizing the authorities, the people that were in charge of religion in his society. He also said nothing can be more contrary to religion and the clergy than reason and common sense. Again, arguing that he saw most of those who were in charge of these religious institutions were not basing their power and ideas on reason, but rather on greed and selfishness. I have always made one prayer to God, a very short one. Here it is. My God, make our enemies very ridiculous. God has granted it to me. Voltaire championed free speech and denounced government and church's use of censorship. And this is what will eventually make him seem more radical in the minds of many governing forces, especially those in French society where he lived. They had an absolute monarchy that had the Roman Catholic Church in place. No publishers or others may print or reprint anywhere in the kingdom any books without having obtained permission in advance by letters sealed with the Great Seal, was an edict that came out from the king in France in 1723. This was meant to try to censor these ideas of the Enlightenment that were going around. And then Voltaire said, I may disagree with what you say, but I shall defend to the death your right to say it. An advocate of free speech. He also said, think for yourselves and let others enjoy the privilege to do so also, or to. Let us read and let us dance, two amusements that will never do any harm to the world. Another Voltaireism. And one more, I know many books which have bored their readers, but I know of none which has done real evil. In other words, reading about ideas do not cause evil to happen in the world. Anything too stupid to be said is sung. To succeed in the world is not enough to be stupid. You must also be well-mannered. He's basically criticizing the nobility there. Common sense is not so common. These are all little quips that are very famous Voltaire quotes. Every man is guilty of all the good he did not do. I hate women because they always know where things are, which is kind of funny, actually. Judge a man by his questions rather than by his answers, because his questions tell you how he really is thinking. God is a comedian playing to an audience too afraid to laugh. Behind every successful man stands a surprised mother-in-law. Never argue at the dinner table, for the one who is not hungry always gets the best of the argument because he's too busy talking to eat. No snowflake in an avalanche ever feels responsible. When it is a question of money, everybody is of the same religion. Now let's move on to another French philosopher. He's actually Swiss, but he eventually moves to France. His name is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And in 1762, he presented his ideas on education in his book, Emile. In this book, he talked about having a natural education. This natural education should replace rigid schooling. He believed that the way that people educated themselves back in the caveman days, based on things that they really needed to know to stay alive, was before things got so messed up, that society ultimately tainted the noble savage, as he called him. The noblest work in education is to make a reasoning man, and we expect to train a young child by making him reason. This is beginning at the end. This is making an instrument of a result. If children understood how to reason, they would not need to be educated. In other words, teach them how to fish rather than fishing for them. Every mind has its own form. In 1762, Rousseau also wrote a book called The Social Contract, which discusses the role of government according to his opinion. He believed that power lies in the general will of the people. Ultimately, that's kind of like saying majority rules. Whatever the majority of society wants, the general will, if you will, is what the society should have. And that's how decisions should be made and how government is formed in a society, based on the general will. This does not take into account, however, a sizable minority, if you will. The first man who, having fenced in a piece of land, said, "This is mine," and found people naive enough to believe him. That man was the true founder of civil society. From how many crimes, wars, and murders, from how many horrors and misfortunes might not anyone have saved mankind by pulling up the stakes or filling up the ditch and crying to his fellows, "Beware of listening to this impostor. You are undone if you once forget that the fruits of the earth belong to us all, and the earth itself to nobody." Rousseau thought that the problems in society all surrounded around human greed, and human greed was fostered by the idea of private property ownership. Now, Rousseau is similar to Locke in a lot of his ideas about a government. Rousseau believed that rulers were servants of the people, and if they failed to carry out the general will of the people, then they should be removed. Now, remember, Locke said that a king was given power in order to protect the natural rights of man, life, liberty, and property. And if he went against that, then they had the right to rebel against him. They were not being governed by their consent. So their ideas are similar in that way. Rousseau said it this way: as soon as the people are united in one body, it is impossible to offend against one of the members without attacking the body. The social compact sets up among the citizens an equality of such a kind that they all bind themselves to observe the same conditions and should therefore all enjoy the same rights. Thus, from the very nature of the compact, every act of the general will binds or favors all the citizens. In order then that the social compact may not be an empty formula, it tacitly includes the undertaking that whoever refuses to obey the general will shall be compelled to do so by the whole body. In this lies the key to the working of the political machine. This alone legitimizes civil undertakings, which, without it, would be absurd, tyrannical, and liable to the most frightful abuses. Now, our next philosopher is Denis Diderot. 1772, he completed the encyclopedia. Yeah, the encyclopedia, like the encyclopedias that you use online now that have, information on just about anything you can desire to know about. He's the one who came up with that idea in the first place. And ultimately, he designed this because he wanted a place that people could go to look up information about anything they desired to know something about. And ultimately, he spent dozens of years working on this. It was a multi-volume set, and it included most current thinking about science, about math, about art, and about government. It was 17 volumes of articles, 11 volumes of illustrations, 18,000 pages of text, 75,000 entries of different factoids, and 20 million words in total. The goal of an encyclopedia is to assemble all the knowledge scattered on the surface of the earth, to demonstrate the general system to the people with whom we live, and to transmit it to the people who will come after us, so that the works of centuries past is not useless to the centuries which follow, that our descendants, by becoming more learned, may become more virtuous and happier, and that we do not die without having merited being part of the human race. The encyclopedia ultimately helped spread Enlightenment thinking around all of Europe to the reading public. And it undermined ultimately some established authorities, both political and religious. This is one of the things that got Diderot into some trouble with some of the authorities in France where he was located. All things, he said, must be examined, debated, investigated without exception, and without regard for anyone's feelings. Between 1794 and 1807, a person living in the British colonies in North America named Thomas Paine wrote several documents. One of them, of course, was Common Sense, which we'll talk more about when we talk about the American Revolution in the next unit. But he also wrote a document called The Age of Reason, which was kind of designed to summarize the Enlightenment's reliance on reason and free thinking. By the time this was published, the British colonies had freed themselves from British control and had established a new nation known as America, the United States of America. And so the United States of America, being a nation founded on Enlightenment principles, it seems natural that one of those advocates that pushed for the American Revolution in the first place, Thomas Paine, summarizes the Enlightenment and its reliance on reason and free thinking in a book called The Age of Reason. Ultimately, this is a good place to learn in general about what happened during the Enlightenment. What are the basic ideals of the Enlightenment? The age of reason is what now the Enlightenment is referred to. In this book, he said, "It is from the Bible that man has learned cruelty, rapine, and murder, for the belief of a cruel God makes a cruel man." Now, we all know that God is not cruel, that man had in some parts of history skewed the ideas of God, and ultimately were not correct in those assumptions. We believe in a merciful and forgiving God. He also stated in this book, "All national institutions of churches, whether Jewish, Christian, or Turkish, appear to me no other than human inventions set up to terrify and to enslave mankind and monopolize power and profit." Again, he is not criticizing the religion itself, but the people who had come to control these religions. He's arguing against organized religion. He himself was more of a deist that believed in a creator God, believed in a merciful God, but did not believe that the people who ran religious organizations in 18th century society were always the best people. The Enlightenment ideas influenced people to challenge existing social relations. Suffrage, or who had the right to vote for given things in governments like the constitutional monarchy of England. As we know, only the wealthy had the right to vote for parliament, but over time that will change and we'll see more and more people given that right to vote, and not just in England, but in other places as well. It also challenged existing social relations like the abolition of slavery and the end of serfdom. We'll talk about all of these concepts as we move forward into future units. Some European monarchs will embrace Enlightenment ideals. They will oftentimes be referred to as enlightened despots or enlightened absolutists. It seems strange to think of Enlightenment principles and absolute government happening simultaneously, but some philosophes encourage rulers to use their power for the good of the people. Now, ultimately, most of the experiments with enlightened despotism or enlightened absolutism didn't really pan out, since those ideas seem kind of counter to each other. Ultimately, most of the enlightened despots will favor despotism more than enlightened reform, ultimately. But there are some experiments with enlightened despotism that are worth noting. In Russia, during the reign of Catherine the Great as Tsarina of Russia between 1762 and 1796, Catherine the Great embraced some of the ideals of Enlightenment reform. She kept a correspondence with many of the Enlightenment philosophes like Voltaire and Diderot, and she tried to advocate for Russia to gain a free press, restricting torture, trying to enshrine religious toleration of the Jews, which had not always been happening in Russia under the Eastern Orthodox Church, and even wanted to recodify the law, establishing a new law code. She wanted to bring enlightened principles to Russia, which she saw as still too backward, and she wanted to finish the work that Peter the Great, who was a few generations ahead of her, had started. She will have some successes, but ultimately she will not. Most of her reforms were on paper and would never fully be embraced by Russian society. Another person who attempts enlightened absolutism or enlightened despotism is in the state of Prussia in Central Europe. Prussia is what eventually will become the nucleus of what will become known as Germany by the time we get into the middle of the 1800s. But Prussia with a P, Prussia's king or Kaiser, Frederick the Great, called himself the first servant of the state and wanted to enact Enlightenment reforms in his state by royal edict. He was another person who kept correspondence with some of these Enlightenment thinkers, these Enlightenment philosophes, including inviting Diderot to live at the royal court in Berlin to help advise him on how to enact some of these reforms into his government. However, by the end of his reign, his reforms will not really be adhered to as much by his successors. So the experiment with enlightened despotism in Prussia would not be complete. He did argue, however, Frederick II argued to Voltaire. He said, I must enlighten my people, cultivate their manners and morals, and make them as happy as human beings can be, or as happy as the means at my disposal permit. Saw himself as the first servant of the state, and it was his duty to bring enlightenment to the people, whether they liked it or not. Frederick introduced the potato to Prussia, which helped to ease the famines that happened there so regularly. I mentioned the potato, that New World product being brought over due to the age of exploration, and how it will transform European diets forever. It's a famine buster, and it, along with other New World products like maize, will help to change European diets and establish, a lot of growth in the population of Europe because it was so easy to plant and easy to grow. So he introduced the potato to try to alleviate starvation in Prussia, and it worked. He initiated a new law code where recodifying the laws to bring them more up to date and make them more understandable. He did end torture as an official practice in the legal system of Prussia, and he allowed some religious toleration, although he did not abolish serfdom completely. So this is why we say some enlightened reforms would be advocated by some of these enlightened absolutists or enlightened despots, but they weren't really completely enlightening their society. Here's one of the reforms he did to try to help power things ultimately as we move in towards the industrial age, which we're not completely there yet, but Der Alfritz and the windmill. Windmills could be used to help power things like, at this point, mills and those kinds of things that would help to grind wheat and those kinds of things into flour to help produce more food for people that could be consumed and help the population growth. We also see him creating what is known as Sanssouci Palace. Sanssouci Palace, we talk about it here. There's a sketch of it. Here's what it really looks like. It's a beautiful place right there in Berlin. The palace and park of Sanssouci was often described as the Prussian Versailles, where a synthesis of the artistic movements of the 18th century in the cities and the courts of Europe come together. That ensemble is a unique example of the architectural creations and landscape design against the backdrop of the intellectual background of monarchic ideas of the state. In other words, enlightened absolutism. The final example of an enlightened despot or an enlightened absolutist that we have is Joseph II of Austria, who reigned from 1780 to 1790, who's the brother of Marie Antoinette, Queen Marie Antoinette of France, who we'll be talking about in a later unit as she is embroiled in the controversy of the French Revolution. But one of the things that Joseph II does in Austria that other enlightened despots did not do was he does officially abolish serfdom in Austrian society. He also abolished a forced labor system in Austria known as the Rabot, and the death penalty was also revoked throughout Austria, except for cases of treason against the state. And he promoted religious toleration. So as far as, the idea of an enlightened despot goes, he'd probably be considered the most successful Unfortunately, his reign was not long enough for his ideals to really stick. Ultimately, his ideas will unravel one by his successors. The Enlightenment ideas, however, will be extremely influential as we move into the late 18th century and into the 19th century. The Enlightenment ideas influenced resistance and rebellions against existing political authority, and we will talk about this more in the next unit because Enlightenment ideals are what foster both the American Revolution and the French Revolution. So more to come there.